The real takeaway from the recent U.S. and China summit. The most important reality emerging from the summit is that the United States and China are no longer seriously trying to rebuild the kind of close partnership that existed during earlier decades of globalization. Instead, both governments appear focused on something far more limited but extremely important: preventing direct confrontation between the world's two largest powers. That is the biggest strategic shift. The atmosphere surrounding the meeting suggested caution, not trust, management, not friendship. Rather than producing dramatic agreements or historic breakthroughs, the summit mainly served as an attempt to stabilize a rivalry that had already begun damaging both countries economically, politically, and strategically. Rising tariffs, technology restrictions, military tensions in Asia, supply chain disruptions, and global uncertainty have created costs for both sides. Welcome to African Stories by Frank Asada. Where are you watching from? Before we dive into the recent U.S. and China summit, we encourage you to rate the video and tell us in the comments below where you are watching from. Like, share, and subscribe so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video coming up. Because of that, analysts increasingly describe the relationship as a managed rivalry or even a stalemate relationship instead of a true diplomatic reset. In other words, neither side believes the other will fundamentally change, but both understand the consequences of uncontrolled escalation could be disastrous for global markets, regional security, and international stability. Beneath the formal speeches and diplomatic smiles, the real goal was reducing the risk of future crisis while protecting each country's long-term strategic interests. 1. China came in confident, not defensive. A few years ago, many American policymakers believed economic pressure could force China to make major political, trade, or strategic concessions. Washington assumed tariffs, sanctions, technology bans, and restrictions on advanced semiconductor access would significantly weaken Beijing's position. But the atmosphere surrounding this summit suggested that assumption is rapidly changing. China no longer appears to view itself as cornered or isolated. Instead, Beijing increasingly presents itself as a country capable of enduring long-term pressure while continuing to grow its influence. Chinese officials now speak less about compromise and more about resilience, national strength, and strategic patience in the face of Western pressure. China's confidence comes partly from its belief that it has already adapted to years of economic and technological confrontation with the United States. Beijing now believes it can survive tariffs, technology restrictions, supply chain pressure, and broader strategic competition over the long term. President Xi Jinping reportedly emphasized strategic stability and long-term coexistence instead of signaling surrender to American demands. That tone matters because it suggests China believes time may increasingly favor Beijing rather than Washington. In Chinese strategic thinking, endurance itself can become a form of power. Rather than rushing toward concessions, China appears prepared for a prolonged period of controlled rivalry while continuing to strengthen its economy, military capabilities, and diplomatic relationships across Asia, Africa, and parts of the developing world. 2. The U.S. wanted economic relief more than confrontation. One of the clearest messages from the summit was that Washington currently appears more focused on economic stability than direct confrontation with China. American officials understand that prolonged tensions between the world's two largest economies can quickly affect inflation, stock markets, manufacturing costs, consumer prices, and overall business confidence. The administration seems increasingly aware that global instability is already stretching economic and political resources. Because of that, the summit projected a more cautious tone than many expected. Instead of aggressively escalating disputes, the United States appeared focused on preventing further shocks that could damage financial markets or worsen economic uncertainty both domestically and internationally. Another major factor shaping Washington's approach is the growing number of simultaneous global crises competing for American attention. The continuing tensions involving Iran, instability around the Straitofhormuz, rising energy concerns, and ongoing military commitments in multiple regions have increased pressure on U.S. policymakers. Any severe confrontation with China could further disrupt global trade and oil markets at a sensitive moment. Domestic political concerns also matter because voters often react strongly to inflation and economic instability. As a result, despite years of aggressive rhetoric toward Beijing, the administration appeared more interested in preserving functional trade channels and avoiding sudden escalation than pursuing direct economic separation or open geopolitical confrontation with China. Early phase of the U.S. and China tensions. For several years, Washington relied heavily on tariffs, sanctions, and trade restrictions in an attempt to pressure China economically. Political rhetoric during this period emphasized competition, economic decoupling, and reducing American dependence on Chinese manufacturing and technology supply chains across several strategic industries. Escalation of global economic pressures. As inflation, supply chain disruptions, and global energy instability increased worldwide, policymakers became more cautious about triggering additional economic shocks. Businesses and financial markets also pushed for more predictable trade conditions because uncertainty between the United States and China was beginning to affect global investment and manufacturing confidence. Middle East instability raises concerns. The conflict involving Iran and growing fears surrounding the Strait of Hormuz increased worries about oil prices and shipping disruptions. American officials recognized that a simultaneous crisis with both China and Iran could severely strain global markets, energy supplies, and domestic political stability inside the United States. Current summit atmosphere. By the time the summit occurred, Washington's priority appeared to shift toward economic stabilization rather than confrontation. The administration still maintained competitive policies toward China, but the overall tone suggested a desire to keep trade functioning, calm financial markets, and avoid another major global economic disruption at this time. 3. Taiwan remains the most dangerous issue. Although trade and economic cooperation received most of the public attention during the summit, Taiwan was likely the most sensitive and dangerous topic discussed behind closed doors. For both Washington and Beijing, Taiwan is not simply a diplomatic disagreement. It represents a major strategic red line tied to military power, national identity, and global credibility. Chinese leaders continue to view Taiwan as part China and strongly oppose any move that appears to support permanent Taiwanese independence. Meanwhile, the United States officially maintains a one China policy while also supporting Taiwan's defensive capabilities. That delicate balance has become increasingly fragile as military exercises, naval patrols, political visits, and regional tensions continue to grow across the Taiwan Strait. Reports surrounding the summit suggested that President Xi Jinping strongly warned President Donald Trump against mishandling the Taiwan issue, reportedly signaling that Beijing views the matter as serious enough to trigger direct confrontation if pushed too far. What stood out, however, was not what happened publicly, but what did not happen. There was no dramatic new American security commitment toward Taiwan, no sudden Chinese military escalation, and no breakthrough agreement resolving tensions. Instead, both governments appear to maintain deliberate ambiguity. That likely reflects the reality that neither side may actually want a war at this moment, especially given the enormous economic and military consequences such a conflict would create globally. Despite the absence of immediate escalation, the underlying danger surrounding Taiwan remains extremely high because the issue combines military pressure, nationalism, and strategic competition all at once. Even a small accident, political misunderstanding, or symbolic gesture could rapidly trigger a larger crisis between the United States and China. Military aircraft interceptions, naval encounters, cyber attacks, or political statements made during election seasons could easily inflame tensions. Unlike trade disputes, Taiwan touches core questions of sovereignty and national pride, making compromise politically difficult for both governments. That is why many analysts increasingly describe Taiwan as the most dangerous flashpoint in the world today. The summit may have temporarily lowered tensions, but it did not remove the deeper structural risks that continue building underneath the surface of U.S.-China relations. While enjoying the analyses, we encourage you to share and subscribe. This will absolutely help our channel grow, and you will never miss any of our new videos coming up. Historical roots of the Taiwan dispute. The Taiwan issue traces back to the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, when the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan after losing control of mainland China to the Communist Party. Since then, Beijing has considered Taiwan part of China, while Taiwan developed its own democratic political system and separate governing institutions over several decades. Rise of strategic ambiguity. For many years, the United States maintained a policy known as strategic ambiguity, where Washington supported Taiwan's self-defense without formally promising direct military intervention. This approach aimed to discourage both a Chinese invasion and any formal Taiwanese declaration of independence, while preserving regional stability and reducing the likelihood of immediate conflict. Growing military and political tensions. In recent years, military exercises around Taiwan increased significantly. China expanded naval patrols, air force operations, and military pressure near the Taiwan Strait. At the same time, high-profile American political visits and stronger security cooperation with Taiwan raised concerns in Beijing that Washington might gradually move toward openly supporting Taiwanese independence in the future. Current summit and ongoing risks. During the summit, Taiwan reportedly remained one of the most sensitive topics discussed privately between both leaders. Although no major escalation occurred, neither side changed its core position. The United States avoided dramatic new commitments, while China avoided immediate escalation. However, analysts warn that unresolved tensions, rising nationalism, and military buildups continue, making Taiwan the most dangerous potential flashpoint between the two global powers today. 4. Economics is now being used as a stabilizer. One of the most important themes emerging from the summit was a growing use of economics as a tool for strategic stabilization rather than pure partnership. Discussions involving possible Boeing purchases, agricultural exports, and energy cooperation appear to carry a broader geopolitical purpose beyond simple commerce. Both Washington and Beijing seem increasingly aware that completely severing economic ties could trigger severe global instability, financial shocks, and political consequences. Because of that, economic engagement is now being treated less as a symbol of friendship and more as a mechanism for crisis prevention. Even while tensions continue over technology, military influence, and regional security, both governments appear interested in maintaining enough commercial interaction to discourage a dangerous collapse in relations. This strategy reflects a major shift from earlier periods when economic cooperation was viewed as a pathway toward deeper political trust and eventual integration. Today, neither side seems to expect ideological convergence or a fully cooperative relationship. Instead, economics is increasingly being used as a form of mutual restraint. Large trade flows, investment links, supply chains, and industrial dependence create costs that both countries would suffer heavily during any military confrontation. In simple terms, both sides appear to believe that staying economically connected makes open conflict less attractive because the damage would spread rapidly through manufacturing, energy markets, financial systems, and global trade networks. That calculation helps explain why both governments continue protecting key commercial relationships despite rising political tensions. Many analysts compare this emerging framework to certain aspects of the Cold War, though with major differences. During the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, both sides relied heavily on nuclear deterrence to prevent direct war. In today's U.S. and China rivalry, economic interdependence has become an additional layer of deterrence. Modern globalization means American and Chinese economies remain deeply connected through trade, technology, finance, shipping, and industrial production. A large-scale conflict could severely damage both nations simultaneously while destabilizing the entire global economy. That does not eliminate the possibility of confrontation, but it creates stronger incentives for caution and controlled competition. In effect, economics is now functioning as a strategic shock absorber designed to slow escalation even as distrust between both powers continues growing underneath the surface. Era of deep economic integration. For decades after China opened its economy in the late 20th century, the United States and China expanded trade rapidly. American companies invested heavily in Chinese manufacturing, while China became deeply integrated into global supply chains. Many policymakers believed economic integration would eventually strengthen political cooperation and reduce long-term geopolitical rivalry between both countries. Shift toward economic competition. As China's economic and military power grew, Washington increasingly viewed Beijing as a strategic competitor rather than simply a trade partner. Tariffs, technology restrictions, and supply chain diversification efforts accelerated. Despite these tensions, businesses and financial institutions on both sides remain heavily interconnected, making complete economic separation extremely difficult and potentially damaging for global markets. Recognition of mutual vulnerability. Over time, both governments realized that severe disruption in economic relations could create worldwide instability. Financial markets, manufacturing systems, shipping routes, food exports, and energy supplies became tightly linked to stable the U.S. and China relations. Policymakers increasingly understood that even limited confrontation could trigger inflation, shortages, market panic, and broader geopolitical uncertainty affecting many countries simultaneously. Current stabilizing strategy. At the summit, economic discussions appeared focused less on friendship and more on maintaining strategic stability. Possible commercial agreements involving aircraft purchases, agriculture, and energy cooperation suggested both sides wanted to preserve enough economic interdependence to discourage military escalation. The broader goal now seems to be managing rivalry carefully while avoiding catastrophic disruption to the global economic system. 5. There are almost no real breakthroughs. Despite the carefully managed diplomatic language and optimistic public statements following the summit, there were very few concrete breakthroughs between the United States and China. Many of the most serious disputes that have defined the relationship over recent years remain unresolved. Tariffs imposed during earlier trade conflicts are still largely in place, while restrictions involving rare earth minerals continue creating tension because both countries depend heavily on strategic industrial resources. Disputes over artificial intelligence development, advanced semiconductors, and high-end technology exports also remain deeply contentious. These issues are especially important because they are directly connected to future military power, economic competitiveness, and technological dominance. Behind the scenes, neither side appears willing to compromise significantly on these strategic areas despite efforts to stabilize overall relations. Military tensions also remain unresolved and continue contributing to deep mistrust between both governments. Naval operations in the South China Sea, military activity near Taiwan, cybersecurity concerns, and strategic competition across Asia still create constant friction between Washington and Beijing. In addition, coordination regarding Iran and broader Middle Eastern instability appeared vague and limited rather than unified. While both powers likely share concerns about regional escalation affecting global oil markets and economic stability, there was little indication of a major joint diplomatic framework emerging from the summit. Taiwan, meanwhile, remains the single most explosive issue in the relationship because it touches questions of sovereignty, military credibility, and national identity for both governments. None of these underlying tensions disappeared during the meeting. Because of that, the summit should probably not be viewed as a transformational diplomatic success. Instead, it was more accurately an attempt to slow the worsening trajectory of the relationship before it became even more dangerous. The rivalry itself remains fully intact. Both sides still fundamentally distrust each other's long-term intentions, military strategies, and geopolitical ambitions. However, leaders on both sides also appear to recognize that uncontrolled escalation could become economically and strategically catastrophic. That explains why the summit focused heavily on communication, crisis management, and preserving functional channels of contact rather than announcing dramatic agreements. In practical terms, the meeting did not solve the core rivalry between the United States and China. It merely reduced immediate pressure temporarily, while leaving most of the deeper structural conflicts unresolved beneath the surface. Trade war and tariff escalation. The modern deterioration in U.S. China relations accelerated during the trade war period, when both governments imposed tariffs on billions of dollars of goods. The economic conflict expanded beyond trade into technology restrictions, supply chain concerns, and strategic competition, creating long-term distrust that still affects negotiations today. Technology and semiconductor confrontation. As artificial intelligence and advanced chip technology became central to economic and military competition, Washington increased restrictions on semiconductor exports and high-tech cooperation with China. Beijing responded by investing heavily in domestic technological independence while restricting certain strategic resources, including critical rare earth materials important for advanced manufacturing industries. Rising military and geopolitical tensions. Military tensions increased steadily through naval patrols, regional alliances, Taiwan Strait confrontations, and cyber competition. Simultaneously, broader global crises involving Iran, energy security, and regional instability complicated diplomatic efforts. These overlapping pressures made it harder for both countries to fully stabilize relations despite continued economic interdependence and diplomatic engagement. Current summit outcome. At the summit, leaders managed to reduce immediate tensions and preserve communication channels, but no major disputes were fully resolved. Trade restrictions, military concerns, Taiwan tensions, and technology rivalries all remained largely unchanged. The meeting succeeded more as a pause in deterioration than as a genuine diplomatic breakthrough or long-term settlement. The deeper geopolitical meaning. The summit may ultimately be remembered less for its specific agreements and more for what it revealed about the changing structure of the global system itself. The world appears to be entering a new geopolitical phase that does not fully resemble the old era of globalization, but also does not look exactly like the Cold War of the 20th century. During earlier decades, many countries believed economic integration would gradually reduce geopolitical rivalry and create a more cooperative international order. That assumption is now weakening. At the same time, however, the United States and China remain too economically connected to completely separate from each other without causing severe global disruption and instability. Instead, the emerging system appears to combine several contradictory realities simultaneously. Economic interdependence continues through trade, manufacturing, investment, and financial markets, while military rivalry intensifies across regions such as the Indo-Pacific. Technological competition is accelerating rapidly as both powers compete over artificial intelligence, semiconductors, cybersecurity, telecommunications, and strategic industries that may define future global influence. Yet despite this growing rivalry, both sides are also trying to maintain controlled tension and avoid direct confrontation. This creates a world where cooperation and competition exist side by side rather than replacing each other completely. Countries may increasingly trade heavily with one another while simultaneously preparing for strategic competition or even potential military conflict. This complicated balance may become the defining global framework of the next decade. Instead of clear alliances and total separation like the Cold War, the future international system could involve selective cooperation mixed with intense rivalry. Nations may cooperate economically in some sectors while restricting technology transfers, strengthening military alliances, and competing for geopolitical influence in others. Smaller countries may also face increasing pressure to navigate carefully between competing global powers without fully choosing sides. The summit highlighted how both Washington and Beijing appear to understand this emerging reality. Neither side expects complete partnership, but neither side appears ready for total separation either. That uncertain middle ground may define global politics, economics, and security for many years ahead. Era of globalization optimism. After the Cold War ended, many governments believed globalization would create deeper international cooperation and reduce geopolitical conflict. Expanding trade, global supply chains, and economic integration were widely seen as forces that would connect nations more closely and gradually reduce the likelihood of major rivalry between powerful countries over time. Rise of strategic competition. As China's economic and military influence expanded, the United States increasingly shifted from viewing China mainly as a trade partner to seeing it as a long-term strategic competitor. Technology disputes, military buildups, cybersecurity concerns, and regional tensions gradually transformed the relationship from cooperative engagement into controlled geopolitical rivalry. Emergence of hybrid global tensions. Unlike the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, modern rivals remain deeply economically interconnected. Trade, finance, energy systems, and manufacturing chains continue linking countries together even while military competition intensifies. This created a new global environment where cooperation and confrontation increasingly occur at the same time. Current global transition phase. The summit reflected this emerging geopolitical reality. The United States and China continue competing militarily, technologically, and strategically while also maintaining economic ties and diplomatic communication. Analysts increasingly believe this hybrid system of rivalry, interdependence, and controlled tension may shape the global order throughout the next decade and possibly beyond. The simplest possible summary. The clearest and simplest message from the summit was that the United States and China still deeply distrust each other, yet neither government currently believes a complete breakdown in relations would be survivable. That reality shaped nearly every aspect of the meeting. Publicly, both sides used polite diplomatic language emphasizing stability, communication, and cooperation where possible. Behind the scenes, however, the major disagreements remained firmly in place. Neither side appeared willing to make major concessions on trade, technology, military posture, Taiwan, or long-term strategic competition. Instead of solving the rivalry, the summit mainly served as an effort to prevent tensions from spiraling into something far more dangerous and economically destructive. This explains why the summit produced relatively few dramatic announcements or concrete victories, despite the high international attention surrounding the event. Both governments understand that a sudden rupture between the world's two largest economies could trigger severe consequences for global markets, manufacturing systems, energy supplies, financial institutions, and regional security. At the same time, both sides continue preparing for long-term competition politically, economically, technologically, and militarily. In many ways, the summit reflected a relationship built less on trust and more on mutual caution. Washington and Beijing appear increasingly focused on managing competition carefully rather than trying to fully defeat or isolate one another in the near future. The broader significance of this reality extends far beyond the summit itself. The relationship between the United States and China now influences nearly every major global issue, including trade, energy, technology, military balance, supply chains, and international diplomacy. Because both countries are so powerful and interconnected, even limited tensions between them can affect economies and political systems worldwide. That is why leaders on both sides appear determined to preserve communication channels, even while strategic distrust continues growing underneath the surface. The summit, therefore, represented not a breakthrough toward friendship, but recognition that controlled rivalry may now be the most realistic path forward in an increasingly unstable global environment. Period of expanding cooperation. For many years, the United States and China expanded economic cooperation through trade, investment, and globalization. Many leaders believed growing economic ties would eventually produce greater political trust and long-term stability between both countries, while reducing the likelihood of serious geopolitical confrontation in the future. Growing distrust and competition. Over time, disagreements involving trade imbalances, military influence, technology development, cybersecurity, and regional power gradually increased tensions. Both governments began viewing each other more cautiously, with strategic rivalry replacing earlier optimism about partnership and integration within the global economic and political system. Recognition of mutual dependence. Despite rising hostility, both countries realize they remain deeply interconnected economically and financially. Supply chains, manufacturing systems, investment flows, and global markets became heavily dependent on stable U.S. and China relations. Policymakers increasingly understood that a complete rupture could create worldwide economic and geopolitical instability, affecting many nations simultaneously. Current summit reality. The summit reflected this complicated balance between rivalry and dependence. Leaders maintained diplomatic politeness and avoided major escalation, but most core disputes remain unresolved. The meeting ultimately demonstrated that both countries are trying to manage dangerous competition carefully because neither side currently believes total separation or open confrontation would be survivable. In the end, the summit was not a celebration of renewed friendship between the United States and China. It was a cautious acknowledgement that the world has entered a far more complicated and dangerous era. Both powers still compete for influence, technology, military advantage, and global leadership, yet both also understand that uncontrolled confrontation could damage not only their own nations, but the entire world economy. That is why the meeting mattered despite producing few dramatic breakthroughs. The real achievement was simply preventing further deterioration, at least for now. But the deeper tensions remain unresolved beneath the diplomatic smiles. Taiwan, technology, trade, energy security, and military rivalry will continue shaping the relationship. The world may now be entering an age defined not by peace or partnership, but by carefully managed competition. Thank you for watching. Please leave comments. We will really love to hear from you. What is your takeaway? We take all comments very seriously. Like, share and subscribe so that you'll be the first to be notified of our next video. Coming up,